on to the lives of tens of millions of workers who have been just creamed in the pandemic. As Oxfam recently documented, the catastrophic failure to shrink inequality has made tens of millions of people at risk of hunger, extreme poverty, sickness, and death. Now, this is a feature, not a bug, of the supply chain model of global capitalism. And that is to keep people poor, keep them enslaved, keep them desperate, and that's the clear path to making huge profits. Now, to be sure, as I discussed in a recent episode, workers in Haiti, one of the poorest countries on the planet, were barely hanging on before the pandemic, and now they've been shoved deeper into the hole of economic deprivation. But in the U.S., it's been a disaster for a so-called developed country. Oxfam, in fact, developed this index to judge each country. And guess what? The U.S. ranks last out of the wealthy G7 countries. That's the G7 countries which comprise the so-called developed countries, and even trails 17 low-income countries like Liberia when it comes to laws that stop anti-unionism or where there is a livable minimum wage. So to talk more about this, it's great to welcome back on the show Paul O'Brien, Oxfam's vice president and the author of a very important forthcoming book, and it's called Power Switch: How We Can Reverse Extreme Inequality. And it isn't really surprising, Paul, that you have these countries all around the world who were already, on a good day, as I sarcastically like to say, on the back foot when it came to surviving economically. When I'm talking about countries, I mean the people, millions of people throughout the world. You've been in this space forever. And I did a segment some weeks ago about, for example, garment workers in Haiti and the reality that mostly women in that industry, as you point out in the report from Oxfam, women have been hit hard, extremely hard, especially in industries that have been heavily women-dominated, especially in the garment industry. And I take Haiti as an example. Haiti, one of the poorest countries on the planet. Then you throw in COVID-19, where industries shut down left and right. And all of a sudden, these folks literally had no money for their families. So in the report, and maybe we'll just take off on this for you to give the sense what's going on in the world, the commitment to reducing inequality index shows that only 26 out of 158 countries were spending a recommended 15% of their budgets on health prior to the pandemic. And so it's not surprise, not just on healthcare, but when you come to wages inequality, that so many countries just were not prepared.
That's exactly right. We've been doing this commitment to reducing inequality index for several years now, and we were really worried with this 2019 data. 2019 was a terrible year for inequality. Right before the pandemic started, we were seeing protest marches because of the kinds of things you're talking about all around the world, on all continents. Thinking about, phone charges in Lebanon and metro charges in Chile and fuel prices all over sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. We were watching people on the streets protesting about growing inequality, the underinvestment in protecting the more vulnerable people. Yes, it was disproportionately affecting women. The people on the streets weren't always the women, but they were often the family members who were not being able to put bread on the table. So we were really worried about what was going on with growing inequality right before the pandemic started. And then the pandemic hit and doubled down on the problem. So it's been a really, I couldn't agree more with your Haiti example. Right at the outset of the crisis, we saw 2 million garment workers in Bangladesh just sent home. Same kind of deal. Just, you have around the world somewhere in the range of 2 billion informal workers that are facing no employment insurance, no serious social protection, often facing autocratic lockdowns, on the wrong ends of inequality. And so the pandemic itself, they were underprepared for it when it hit, and the pandemic has exacerbated the problem.
And this is true, probably perhaps even more so in countries that had infrastructures that were wobbly from the get-go, right? Where you basically had no healthcare infrastructure, where disease was rampant. And the first thing that popped to my mind was housing, when you think about the notion of social distancing, which we make so much of a big deal in the United States and in richer countries, how can you socially distance in a country where you're living crammed together in slums? And especially I'm thinking of workers in industries like the garment industry. That makes no sense. It has no reality on the ground.
Right. That's entirely right. You look at, for a focus for us, some of the larger slum communities in South Asia, in Mumbai, in Karachi, in South Africa, one of the world's largest slums, Mexico City, Nairobi, and all of those preventative measures that we seem unwilling to take, but at least have the choice to take in our northern, more affluent economies are just not available. You can't get the basic health equipment. You can't do social distancing. You can't sit at your computer and try to provide added value by working virtually. And those five that I mentioned, millions of people in these slums incapable of doing taking the kinds of measures that you wanted to see in light of the pandemic. We were looking at more than 40, I think it's 46 countries it's 41 countries whose debt payments, just the payments they were paying on their debts, were 4 times the amount in any given year as their health budgets. So 400% of their health budgets. So these are health budgets that are a fraction of what they need to be, money leaving the country and just completely underprepared for what's happening. And so then we assess, with this commitment to reducing inequality, are governments putting in place serious policies to try and address both the expenditure needs, but where they're going to get the resources from? Are they going to get it in more progressive forms of taxation from the richest in their societies? Are they going to provide basic labor protections? And are they going to make some expenditures on things that will protect people from the worst ravages of inequality and the pandemic? So that's what we were measuring. And it was, as you say, all around the world, it was a pretty rough story. And I have to say the United States did not fare well either.
Well, we know that, and it's a perfect segue. I don't want to leave necessarily the rest of the world, and we'll keep linking to it. But one of the things that strikes me about the United States and the people in the United States, frankly, there's a level of selfishness in this country about dealing with the pandemic. And what I mean by that, it's selfishness towards the rest of the world. And here's my rough theory and my rough ramble about this. People make a big deal in lots of communities about not wearing masks. It's become sort of a political divide. And when I think about this, here's what I think about why it's selfish. Because as long as this country is sick and the economy is essentially shut down and essentially not functioning, that affects people all around the world. Because if you have a garment sector that is shut down in other countries, that much of it is supplying its product to this country, certainly other countries, but certainly the United States is the largest economy in the world. When we keep the economy shut down, partly because of the president who doesn't want to take this seriously, and individually, when people just say, oh, we're not going to wear masks, essentially the continued pandemic here in this country affects people all around the world, including, for example, the garment workers that we talked about in Haiti.
That's really interesting. I'm going to give you it's a corollary of that. I think it's a supportive of that, but it's another angle of that. So I'm reading in the news this morning how Chinese growth quarter on quarter is pretty much back up to pre-pandemic levels, and they've essentially got the pandemic under control, and therefore their export-oriented industries, their manufacturing industries, and even their consumption is way back up. Indeed. So if the argument is that what we do at home in these big economies affects folks everywhere, one could argue the Chinese know that, and they are going to be viewed as responsible global citizens by looking after their economy, taking the health measures which they could afford to take to get their economy back up and running. And now they are going to be both the beneficiaries, but the benefactors of a growing recovery by getting everything back up to speed again. Meanwhile, we're having silly debates over whether it is an imposition on our personal freedoms to have to stop infecting other people. And I mean, I'm sorry, but these are narcissistic arguments at a moment where there are real issues of where influence lies in the world now.
Mm.
And so one would hope for leadership that is going to put this to rest, and reassert sort of what is best about um, the American approach. Because the one thing you do worry about with the Chinese context is maybe they've got their health crisis sorted out, but who knows how much free will was exercised by populations in adhering to policies. I mean, no one would wish for the level of oppression that goes on in China. But if you can't combine responsible leadership with optimizing the use of responsible free will to make this society healthier, we've got a problem.
And to be clear, right, to build on your point, China certainly did that because it has an authoritarian regime. But the corollary to that is China is really focused on essentially being the place for global capitalism in terms of supply chain production. And they wanted to get that geared up very quickly because that's a huge amount of revenue that China derives, which is its export industries, obviously. But my point is that, and I think we agree on this, that the notion that this country is somehow able to continue operating in the pandemic, and I took this partly when I read your part of your book, which talked about whether Americans really care about what's going around in the world, and do people in this country want to engage with the rest of the world. And I'm going to take that up in a couple of minutes with you. But my point is that if we had a much more communitarian approach, I like to say perhaps a Scandinavian approach, because in your index, I noticed that the Scandinavian countries, not surprisingly, rank quite high in just about everything that you measured. If we had a more Scandinavian approach and we thought about the world as part of us, then we would understand that when you are wearing a mask, you are actually helping those millions of people around the globe who are basically close to starvation, because indirectly you're potentially bringing about the reopening of their economies.
Yes. Well, couldn't agree more. There's this famous, once you get past the name calling and the sort of the words that are used a little too easily to dismiss deep argument, such as, a socialist approach to addressing a particular issue. Once you get into the actual substance of it, you actually find that Americans often want precisely the kind of economic distribution patterns that you see in relatively healthy economies like the Scandinavian countries. When polls have been taken of Americans on what they'd like in terms of the quintile expenditures and quintile wealth, meaning they want those who work harder and who are richer to get more than those who work less and get less. When you ask them what quintile breakdowns they want, they're sometimes surprised to hear that the countries that most reflect what they actually want in terms of wealth distribution are more like Scandinavia than they are like the United States. And people don't actually really want such a proportion of our national wealth to be held in so few hands, even as they want in the American way to reward hard work and to promote opportunity that is truly fair. So sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say in the index, when we measured the United States, it was concerning that of the 158 countries we measured, it came 26th overall, and on some measures, particularly on labor, did really badly compared to countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia. And a lot of that's because of union busting and low minimum wage compared to how wealthy the country is, but it is really deeply disturbing.
Right on that point, we were telepathic, because when I looked at the index and I went down the chart and looked at all the countries and their ratings, workers' rights for the United States, they were ranked number 37. And I wonder whether that's too generous, because I gather, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that when you look at producing an index, there's certain criteria that are pretty locked in that you use to evaluate, like, do you have the right to strike, and so on. And a lot of that, I assume, is connected to actual legislation and rights that are in the law. But you really telegraphed just now that the problem in the United States is that even the labor laws that are inscribed and are in writing are undermined by a huge union busting industry and anti-unionism. And I wonder whether that rank of 37 is quite generous compared to actually what happens on the ground.
Well, let's be clear. It doesn't do well on labor in the sense that the countries that it's behind every major OECD Western economy. It's the last of the G7 on inequality overall, and it does much worse on labor issues than any of those countries. And there are specific labor protections in the law. The US is alone with Papua New Guinea and Tonga on not having paid parental leave in our laws. So there are essential labor rights which are considered just normal in many less affluent countries that we don't consider to be a legal right here. But I do think that you're right to put your finger on the two of the areas. Well, one of the areas that has really affected is the anti-union culture and legislation and practices that which is one of our indicators under our labor bucket. It's one of the three labor buckets that gives the US such a tough score. The other is the minimum wages compared to the level of wealth in the country. And we have both the global index, which measures that, and then we have a state-by-state assessment of that, where we look at which states in the United States have the best labor protections and the best minimum wages and so on.
Yes, we're really, and I've pointed this out on this show a number of times, we're really creating in the United States two countries. Roughly half of the states, 25 states, have minimum wages that are now close to or even above $15 an hour. And then you have the other half of the states, unfortunately, what people usually refer to as the so-called red states, although they may not be as red as we think in this approaching election, but that's another topic for another time. But there's half of the states have minimum wages that are still at that $7.25 and very, very low. And so you almost can see a migration pattern that could emerge where people are going to say, why should I live in Mississippi or Alabama? I'm going to move to California where the minimum wage is $15 an hour.
Yeah, that's right.
Even though the housing costs are very high in California, so that makes it very difficult.
It can be closer to home too. I live in Washington, D.C., in the city itself, and we actually rank, if we were a state, we'd rank #1 in the nation on basic labor protections. But if
you guys are always bragging in Washington, D.C. that it's the best place to be. Stop it.
5 miles down the road, if I moved to Virginia, I'd be in the worst state to live in the union. And so it's a little close to home, but generally I think you're right.
Now, one thing that was mentioned in the full report on measuring all sorts of criteria was sick leave. And I think that's really crucial to the question of COVID-19. And again, we've done a ton of segments about workers on the front lines in all sorts of injuries, in all sorts of industries, from poultry to retail to transportation. And one of the things that is just pretty clear, when you don't have paid sick leave, you are forced to go to work, and then two things happen. Either you are sick and therefore you get your coworkers sick, or you're sick and you can't stay home to get healthy, which then puts a burden on your family because you're going to have all sorts of healthcare costs. You're going to go to the hospital. So the fact that we don't have paid sick leave in this country just became so apparent as a negative and in really undermining the people during this pandemic.
Yeah, well said. Our lens into that was the work we did with partners working in the poultry sector and watching what folks were dealing with. I mean, we were watching workers who were literally not allowed to leave the line, where they were and forced to wear adult diapers so that they could go to the restrooms without losing their jobs and staying on the line. And then you have that sector being declared, essential in terms of producing our food, and COVID strikes, and everything you just say happens, and there's no sick leaves or basic protections. And so we end up where we are, and we're still dealing with it. I will say the one thing I haven't said as explicitly as I might on this front is there is a racial dimension in that we found as we've looked in this country at it, with less than, in range of 1 in 10 Latinx and African-American households not having health in having health insurance, 1 in 10, where 7 in 10 of white households have health insurance. So there are obviously economic disparities too, but race is a big issue.
Race and gender together,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah,
women are disproportionately
yeah.
in this country and obviously around the world, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. Both in this country and we see it around the world, disproportionate impact, and both on all fronts of our, on our three indicators that we're looking at in the index. One is labor, so we've really talked a lot about that, but also on social expenditures in the health and the education sector, where there's underinvestment, disproportionately affecting women. And then another, which I know you think and talk about a lot, is whether the sources of revenue and the tax systems are sufficiently fair. And where you have, really regressive systems, VAT, where they're imposing it on foodstuffs, again, it has a gender impact. Whereas if they're not taxing wealth, they're not taxing high income, that tends to benefit disproportionately males in the population. So across the board, and where the money comes from, taxes, where it gets spent, and labor, we see gender differences.
So now let's move to big think macro ideas, because I know you're a big thinker and you've got kind of the globe to think about in your long work and also in your book, The Power Switch, which we're going to do a future show focusing deeply on the book. The first is, doesn't this expose the basically sickness of global capitalism? Because when we talk about all these things about anti-union policies, low wages, no sick leave, as the saying goes, it's a feature, not a bug. And what COVID-19 did was expose in a very harsh way really what we know and what you've worked on for so many years, that this is really at heart the sickness of the economic system as a whole. And one wonders then, does this give us an opening to have that conversation with people in a way that you couldn't do before the pandemic? Now, no one wants the pandemic to be the antidote for this, obviously, because of the disaster and the sickness and the horrible things that have happened to people. But I wonder if it's opened up a window for people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question. No one would have wished it, but now that it's here, are we fully understanding the level of disruption that this pandemic is going to bring to the policy space? And is there an opportunity to rethink some very tired assumptions as a consequence? So I'm with you 100% on that. And I have the luxury of thinking about it more in the book. But for us at Oxfam, this is where we are thinking about things right now. As I said, at the top of the show, 2019 was already a very, very troubling year for us in terms of stability of many of the countries in which we work, the role of the United States in the world. You'd had Trump continually diminishing US standing and undermining the institutions, rights, and the spaces that helped to stabilize economies. And we had been working off a pretty tired economic model to start with. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is the amount, when Reagan came in, and I know you've had others on your show that think about this, and I'm in alignment with them on this. When in that period in the early 80s, a huge amount of transformative change happened both in the United States, but also to the global economy, that set in place new rules in a fairly short period of time, the legacies of which we are in many ways still dealing with. And the way you characterize the global system, neoliberal economic models, trickle-down economics, government being the problem rather than the source of the solution, I trace a lot of it back to that period of time and the export of those ideas, the Milton Friedman school of thought on how to make an economy function, to that era. And I am one of many who is now asking, not just for the United States, but for the global economy, if we are going to see an economic recovery coming out of this pandemic, maybe there is a greater opportunity now with the level of economic and health crisis we're seeing to break out of tired assumptions and to ask, what do we actually need when it comes to labor protections, to investments in the most vulnerable, and in progressive taxation, to name the three issues in the index that we haven't been able to talk seriously about for a very long time. Mm. It used to be normal to talk about the fact that if somebody was earning or had wealth that allowed them to accumulate so much money that it wasn't just toys they could buy, but a disproportionate amount of political power, that you should be able to tax that at a fairly significant margin. Average global tax rates in 1980 were at around 62%. Now they're less than 40%. And then to get that kind of average globally, you have to have every country moving in the direction away from actually taxing top earners and owners progressively.
And what you do when you create that system is you come to a pandemic where everybody's suffering except for a few billionaires who are making
Yep.
money hand over fist. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but something like the top 5 billionaires, meaning Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and 3 or 4 others, made several $100 billion over this short period of the pandemic while everybody else was losing money and out of work, which kind of encapsulates what you just said.
It's just ludicrous. The one that blows me, or my Oxfam colleagues came up with, was that Jeff Bezos could walk around to every single one of his 875,000 employees and hand them a check for $105,000 each, and still have more money than he started the pandemic with.
Jesus Christ. Well, this is the great example. One of my hobby horses, why I do not shop at Amazon. Yeah. I don't spend a single dollar there. And it's been one of my little campaigns that every so often I post. Don't buy from Amazon. And certainly books, you should be able to buy from independent bookstores. But I consider Jeff Bezos to be one of the scars on humanity for the very reason that you talk about, not the least of which is he's extremely anti-union, to your point before. If Amazon was fully unionized and people were getting decent wages, I still would be against his wealth, but I could see at least that the workers were being treated well. But he's viciously anti-union. And as you well know, at Amazon, people have been getting sick and some have died during the pandemic. Yeah. Now, perfect transition to the other big point. And this is a point that you make quite well in your book. And I had a chance to read that, which is you challenge, and it spoke right to me very strongly, because it's one thing that I've been very skeptical of and harsh about, American exceptionalism. And the notion that so many Americans, I don't know if it's true about younger people, meaning folks under 25, because I think they've grown up in a different context, but certainly older folks, people say north of 40, still believe in this notion that America somehow stands out head and shoulders above every other country. Now, I consider that to be deeply racist to continue to articulate it. But the problem is that we have both parties saying this. It isn't just Republicans running around saying this. Democrats always say it. Hey, America's the greatest country in the world. I don't believe that. I don't think this country is any better than any other country. I wonder what you're thinking about that as the way the world looks at the United States now, and the way Americans, from your perception, are now thinking about American exceptionalism.
Yeah. Well, and putting my cards on the table, I'm a migrant to this country and a believer and a convert to the ideas that I saw as a young person in Ireland being debated here, the political values and systems. I've cast my vote already, and I've always felt this is the place I wanted to show up as a citizen and ask it to live up to its best aspirations. But I do think that you're right, that even for so many migrants like me and others, there's something very, very special and different saying that, starting a conversation about foreign policy that starts from the premise that the United States is a priori on its face, without even having to work on it, just better than others, reeks of either not being willing to hold yourself to a fair competition of ideas, or a lack of grasp on changing realities, because the numbers in our index and on many other counts are not showing performance. What they're showing is the opposite, that if you measure the strength of a society by how it treats its more vulnerable people, the United States is not doing well. And going into a foreign policy discussion and starting to use words of, well, we're different, so we're going to apply a different set of rules, after 4 years of Trump, is not the best way to re-achieve some level of credibility and partnership with countries who you now have to work with to get things done. So I don't believe the language of exceptionalism is actually helpful anymore. And I think the presumption of it is toxic.
Yes, absolutely. It's never been true just on the face of just the facts. If you look at all the things, in fact, your index shows that, and many other indexes where the U.S. ranks in all sorts of measurements like childcare, vacation, and all those other kinds of things that we would associate with a good country. But here, to your point about foreign policy, that American exceptionalism belief then justifies spending huge amounts on the military and the Pentagon, which in fact is part of the reason we have such yawning inequality, because
Yeah.
American exceptionalism justifies this because
Yeah.
we, America, we're the superpower and we have to basically be the police force of the world. And
Yes.
that predates Trump. That's Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah. I mean, look, just to go back to an earlier topic, I'm actually really hopeful of of the right kind of competition between an American idea of how our world might work fairly, which is, in my view, rights-based and principled and focused on a trust in institutions, not in men or women, or women, frankly, but in checks and balances and the separation of powers, core American ideas, and the Chinese model. But the reality, I would love to see a competition around what is better for our world based on an American set of values versus a Chinese model. But I'll tell you one thing, if the Chinese are pouring more concrete now every 3 years than the United States poured in the entire 20th century, while the United States is involved in conflicts indirectly or directly in 150 countries around the world, you've got to ask if the United States is bringing the right equipment to that competition. If we continue to feel that it is our job to be the police force and to have a militarized foreign policy as our credibility diminishes with Trump, we are going to find it incredibly costly, and not just in terms of how much it costs, but the opportunity cost of not doing other things. And what I would be really hopeful for, and I'm hopeful for with the new political season, is a reinvestment and re-engagement, not exceptionalism, by the United States in non-military expenditures. And because I still believe that the principles and values that the United States offers the world are profoundly attractive to most countries. But they've got to be changed from a trickle down growth model to a more inclusive growth model. You've got to get the opportunity back into the dream that you're offering other countries, because they're looking at our economy and they're saying, if that's the American dream and you're leaving that number of people behind, no thank you.
And while I would say my guess is that assuming there's a change in administrations in the next few months or starting in 2 weeks, um, you will get more of perhaps the concrete pouring money. But unfortunately, the Democratic nominee believes in American exceptionalism as much as anyone before him. And he talks about almost like the God given delivery of America to the world. So I believe that we, those of us who think American exceptionalism is a cancer, frankly, if I can be
Yeah.
as bold, is still going to continue. And it's still going to be mouthed by both parties and certainly, unfortunately, by the Democrats as well.
Well, I'm going to be, maybe because it's my professional requirement, but
Objective.
I'm going to be optimistic.
Okay.
And as you know, there's a quote that I do use in the book, which is, pessimists are usually right and optimists are usually wrong, but all the good things are done by optimists. So here's my optimism. I kind of agree with you that anybody who assumes that a Biden-Harris administration is necessarily going to be good for the global fight against inequality, I think has drank too much of their own Kool-Aid. The word that I debate in that is necessarily. I think they will feel that they've gotten into power with essentially a moderate and possibly a moderate and progressive mandate to deliver something other than the Trump administration was delivering. But the real debate that's going to happen then, from a humanitarian development inequality perspective, is almost a battle for the soul of those who are in power. And do they realize that what put them into power was a coming together of a lot of people who were not looking to go back 4 years or to an old neoliberal economic model that was leaving too many people behind? And will they see that there's not just a lot of good policy sense, but a lot of political energy behind offering a truly transformative and not just restorative economic agenda. So my pitch is, I think one of our real problems with this pandemic is people are tired, rightfully so, and it's going to be a huge amount of work to get us to these elections, and everybody's going to want to just go, thank you, we're done. But the real work's going to start once we have an electoral outcome as to what kinds of policies are going to be put in place to get our world moving forward. So I think a lot of work is going to need to happen next year.
Well, that's a good point to say to you that we're going to have you back on the show to talk about Power Switch, your forthcoming book, in the context of looking at what is being done or not being done by, I'm going to be optimistic, the new administration and the new power structure in Washington. It's always great to have you on the show, Paul. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. Look forward to chatting again anytime.